I almost feel like EA is getting scared this game isn't going to sell, and they're trying to do everything they possibly can to make PC gamers happy. Look at this. Dragon Age the Veilguard won't include any third-party DRM, such as Denuvo, on any platform. Coming from EA, this is really unexpected, at least for me, and not at all unwelcome. So that's cool. The one downside they're mentioning to that is that means you can't preload the game before the release date. You will have to wait until launch day on October 31st at 9 a.m. PDT to start downloading the game. But I think most players would take that trade to not have Denuvo. Also, it looks like the game is Steam native, does not require a EA launcher unless you want to use it. So really cool. Also Steam Deck verified. We're getting these system requirements today, and while I have some nitpicks like, optional upscaling is apparently being used in these system requirements, more on that in a minute, overall it looks like you only need a GTX 970 to jump into the game. And the recommended specs for the game are an RTX 2070 along with a 100 gigabyte SSD, a CPU along the lines of a Ryzen 7 3700X or i9-9900K, and that should get you to high settings at 1080p 60 or 1440p 30, as long as you have 16 gigabytes of RAM to go with it. Now, I was pricing out a build like this, and I actually saw at Jawa, you could get an entire build along these lines, actually with a slightly more powerful GPU, although a slightly less cores on the CPU here. But with the full NVMe, you would need the 16 gigabytes of RAM and all of that for actually only $375 used on this pre-built system. So that seems like a pretty crazy deal. Also, I can save you $10 off your first purchase at Jawa if you follow the link in the video description and or pinned comment, and a huge thank you for them sponsoring today's video. I also want to mention that the ray tracing build that recommends a 3080, you can find 3080 pre-built systems in here with even better CPUs than are what are recommended for the game for under $1,000, or you could buy the individual parts. Like if you just want that recommended RTX 2070, get it for 160, or hey, how about 150 if you use my $10 off coupon up there. And if you're like, wait, what is Jawa anyway? It's the marketplace for gamers. You get the absolute best prices on custom pre-built PCs and gear, backed by buyer and seller protections that actually matter. And speaking of sellers, in addition to buying your parts here, you can also become a seller or even sell directly to Jawa if you're looking for the simplest and fastest way to sell your parts to fund your upgrade. They sell, you can sell GPUs and CPUs directly to Jawa, or like I said, you could create your own listings and become a verified seller. The process for selling directly to Jawa is incredibly simple. You share details about your part for an instant offer. You print your free shipping label, mail them the part. They inspect it to make sure everything checks out, and most sellers get paid within 1 business day after the part is received. So again, huge thank you for them sponsoring today's video. Click the link in the video description and or pinned comment for more information on all of that. But let's dig a little bit deeper into these system requirements. My biggest thing, like I said, I don't like is that it is mentioning that the average performance estimates include use of optional upscaling. And what I don't like there is that, first of all, I don't really like upscaling being included in the average performance, although realistically, a lot of people these days are using it when they actually play the game. So I would be more forgiving of it if they at least told us what upscaling setting was being used. Quality setting, performance setting, that makes a very big difference in terms of image quality, depending on what graphics settings we're using. Also, what kind of upscaling does the game support? So let's actually dive a bit into the PC-specific features, because it does look like the game actually has put a lot of thought into the PC support. So I actually think I will mention this because a while back, they did mention that many at BioWare are PC players themselves, and when testing, PCs made up 40% of their testing effort with over 200,000 hours of performance and compatibility testing. So they're at least claiming that, PC is not an afterthought for them. And there are some signs that that might actually be the case. For example, it does look like the graphics settings menu does say that most changes to graphics and display settings are reflected in real time, and that there is a cutout when you're in the menu where you can see what's happening in the world with your characters and environment as you change those settings, which is one of the big features I like to see in a PC graphics menu. And you can see that there are a bunch of graphic settings options here as well. And again, they did say that the game is completely Steam native, and is also Steam Deck verified. So some thoughts on, is this going to support lower end hardware? Well, if they're going through the trouble to be Steam Deck verified, then in addition to the minimum spec not looking too crazy demanding, that's another sign that, if it can run well on Steam Deck, which again, verified doesn't always mean it'll actually run well on Steam Deck, although hopefully it does, it's at least a good sign that they're putting some thought into that. It does mention that cloud saves on Steam supported. And they're also saying remote play is enabled. And again, they say that the linking to your EA account is completely optional. So completely optional linking to your EA account. So that's really good because, again, I'd rather not have the EA launcher going if I don't need to, so nice to see. Now again, back to some of the upscaling support, since they are mentioning upscaling in the system requirements. It does look like they have DLSS 3, FSR 2.2, not 3.1, and XeSS. They do mention DLSS 3 frame generation, but don't mention any kind of AMD frame generation, so that's a bit disappointing. I did see in some of their other materials they've put out that their FSR version is a bit custom, so it sounds like they have at least put some effort into making sure FSR looks as good as possible for this game. But again, it doesn't look like the frame generation will be available unless you have an NVIDIA 40 class or above GPU. Now, we do have optional dynamic resolution scaling, which is nice to see because a lot of PC games don't support it, but it's nice to have because if you're like, well, I just want to set the performance to my monitor's refresh rate and let upscaling just kind of fill in the gap as needed, it can be nice to have when it works well. We'll have to test that out at launch. We're also seeing full ultra-wide support, uncapped frame rate support, VSync support, HDR support. Looks like cinematic aspect ratio, so that if you're on a 21:9 monitor, it looks like then you can turn off the black bars to fill the screen. So anyway, it looks like you get some control over whether you get black bars on things, which is good. Again, lots of graphic settings available. And one interesting thing with ray tracing is that it looks like, in addition to having several settings like ray trace reflections, ambient occlusion, and an ultra ray tracing setting, there also appears to be a selective mode. Selective mode, they say, enables ray tracing features in specific areas that can best take advantage of the feature. So this looks like a more thoughtfully applied mode where it's like, okay, can we get some of the most noticeable impact to this scene from ray tracing while maybe not killing frame rate quite as badly as just cranking all the features up? So again, a lot of this is good signs that they're putting thought into the PC version of the game. Now, where personally, as a Dragon Age player since the first game, I'm a little nervous about the actual gameplay content and direction and art style that I've seen so far. But it looks like at least on the surface level PC feature set, a lot of what we would like to see does seem to be here. So that's good, at least. Now, let's pull back a little on these system requirements. So what do we see here? I'm gonna shrink down and maybe I'll become the mouse pointer. So what do we see? We get 6 different modes, and it is nice that they're telling us the average performance and the in-game preset that it's targeting, which is good. But again, the one big caveat being, like I said, that their average performance is including optional upscaling, but not telling us what setting the upscaling is running at. So that's kind of the big cloud hanging over all of this. Now, for storage, it is asking for 100 gigabytes, and at minimum SSD preferred, but they do mention that a hard drive is at least supported. But they definitely say that anything beyond the minimum settings and performance is SSD required. So you would definitely want an SSD here, and you want 100 gigabytes of space on it. For VRAM, you want at least 4 gigabytes on the minimum settings, 8 gigabytes for, it looks like, the high settings. Ultra settings go up to 12, including the, and turning ray tracing on means you'd want at least 10 gigabytes. So 10 gigabytes, and 12 gigabytes of VRAM here. So it looks like the 8 gigabyte NVIDIA cards that are marketed on ray tracing, we'll have to see how that goes for them. Anyway, if we have RAM, it looks like 16 gigabytes across the board is what they're looking for. And then I think people are more interested in the GPUs, but why don't we knock CPUs out of the way real quick first? So if we zoom in here, if you want to just play the game at 30 frames per second at the lowest possible settings, It looks like they want you to have at least an i5-8400 or a Ryzen 3 3300X. Now, I did go ahead and pull up those parts. It'll be a bit of a lighter background here, so watch your eyes. Flashbang warning. Okay. Anyway, the i5-8400 6-core, 6-thread part from a while ago. It looks like these came out in 2017. So asking for kind of a mid-range part from 7 years ago. So not asking for anything massive. But again, it's not absolutely nothing. So if you are on an older system, do check in where you fall compared to these. And the Ryzen 3 3300X is a 4-core, 8-thread, lower-end part from AMD back in 2020. So newer part, but also lower-end, lower core count, and all of that. So that's what you need to get in the door on the CPUs. And then for the rest of the CPUs, you'll notice that if you want to get up to 60 frames per second, they're saying that it'd be better to have a Ryzen 7 3700X, so same generation as their Min 1, but with a lot more cores and threads and performance, or going up to an i9 9900K, which seems like honestly an odd choice unless the game is really core and thread heavy, more so than most games are. And I'm a little suspicious that's the case, because when you move up to the ultra settings, they're recommending high core count parts, 16 core, 24 thread part from the 12900K and a 16 core, 32 thread part from the 7950X. So if we want to look at these in a little bit more detail, again, the recommended parts were the i9 9900K 8-core 16-thread part from 2018 and the Ryzen 7 3700X 8-core 16-thread part from 2019 from AMD. So again, heavy on the cores and threads. And like I said, their ultra settings are mentioning a 16-core 24-thread i9 12900K from Intel, which is a high-end chip from 2021. So we're asking for quite a bit here. And the AMD listed is a 16-core 32-thread Ryzen 9 7950X coming out in 2022 and a high-end part. These are the same things that we see as we scroll over into the ray tracing settings. Ray tracing is one of the graphic settings that often is more CPU demanding, and they are putting these higher core count parts over here on the ray tracing side of things. So do keep that in mind, and I wanted to mention it up front that this game does potentially get a little heavy on the CPU, at least going by the system requirements. We don't know how accurate that'll actually be until we get the game to benchmark. All right, the moment you've all been waiting for, but okay, how about the GPUs? Well, to just play the game at 1080p 30 FPS, but when I say 1080p, remember the caveat of they're saying that this includes the use of upscaling. We don't know how aggressively. They're asking for a GTX 970 and at least 4 gigabytes of VRAM or an R9 290X. They're also mentioning a GTX 1650 would also kind of fall into this class. Now, if I pull up Tech PowerUp's relative performance chart, we can kind of see where these fall, and you could maybe get an idea of where your GPU would fall in comparison. Let me zoom in a bit here so you can see it. So in other words, a lot of times people have trouble reading a system requirements list because your own part isn't listed. So what do? I'll link this relative performance chart in the video description, and what you do is you find your GPU and you check how it performs relative to the parts listed in the system requirements list. Also, maybe clicking on the parts to check if you have enough VRAM as well. Anyway, the GTX 970 and 290X actually are fairly close in relative performance, so at least there's nothing crazy looking there. And they also mentioned a GTX 1650, which falls into 85% of the performance that we're seeing on the 970. So again, similar type of ballpark level of performance. Anyway, so if you're on other parts, like maybe an RX 6400 or a RX 570, 780 Ti, a RTX 40, sorry, not RTX, RX 480, a GTX 1060, you're in the same kind of ballpark of performance. You're not too far off of it. Now, what are they looking for if you want to play the game at high settings, 1080p 60, or they mention 1440p at 30 FPS high settings. So one thing I actually like here is that they're kind of showing that, because some system requirements charts kind of ignore 1440p or things like that. So here you're at least seeing 1440p 30 and 1080p 60 have a similar graphics card demand. If you're leaving them at the same settings. So if you wanted to go up to 1440p 60, you might need to double the GPU power that they're listing here, or more aggressively use the upscaling that they're mentioning. But anyway, so where are we at here? This is an RTX 2070 or an RX 5700 XT. So if we go back to the relative performance chart, again, you might see where your GPU kind of falls in between. So if we leave that 970 as the baseline and we scroll up to the 2070, you may see your GPU kind of passed in between, like a 1660 Super, a 1070. We're still not quite there yet, right? 2060, still not quite there yet. RTX 2070, here we are. We're at about double the performance of the 970, and the 5700 XT is living right next door in the same general ballpark, indicating that a similar level of performance between AMD and NVIDIA counterparts. Again, if you had something like an RX 6600, you're not worlds apart from this performance level, or a 2060 Super, you're pretty close. An Arc A750 from Intel, you'd be pretty close. So an RTX 3060 is also right in this ballpark. So there's a lot of popular GPUs in this general vicinity for that 1080p 60 high settings or 1440p 30. So then my speculation would be, okay, so if we set the 2070 as the baseline and we're like, okay, so if this is 1440p 30-ish, then you would want to almost double the performance if you wanted 1440p 60, which would put you in the ballpark of an RX 6800 XT, RTX 3080, that type of thing at about these settings. So again, that's rough speculation since they didn't actually list it. But that's just kind of, a lot of people might be, what do you need for 1440p 60? And again, remember, all of this is mentioning that upscaling is being used at unknown settings. Anyway, the ultra settings themselves take us to also a resolution increase and frame rate increase. So they're saying if you want to play at 4K 60 with some level of upscaling that's unspecified at ultra settings, but no ray tracing yet, they're saying 4080 or 7900 XTX. So, and again, also they're listing a bigger CPU, which is a little bit weird unless the ultra settings are heavy on the CPU compared to high, which is unusual, but not impossible. I'm just going to mention that seems a bit weird. So maybe those CPUs aren't really required. But if we do go ahead and jump from the 2070 all the way up to a 4080, we're talking about 3 times the performance of the recommended spec. And if I set the 4080 as the baseline, then we are hanging out around the performance of the 7900 XTX. It's usually a little bit faster when we're not using ray tracing, but not vastly so. So again, looking for very top-end hardware if you are looking to play the game at 4K 60 at ultra settings, but not unreasonable as long as, again, you could turn down graphic settings and things like that, or play at lower resolutions. Now, there's also a ray tracing on list, so why don't we take a quick look at that. So for ray tracing selective, remember this was the mode they described as looking at what would be most impactful for the scene that you're in and turning on those ray tracing features but leaving other ones off. So a little more, I guess you might call it, at least hopefully, a more optimized ray tracing approach as opposed to like a brute force ray tracing approach. We're seeing that with the ultra settings as the underlying baseline. So ultra settings without ray tracing and then kicking on the selective ray tracing effects for 1440p 60 or 4K 30, notice 4K 30, but 1440p 60, RTX 3080 or a 6800 XT. I find that pretty interesting because if we look at that, first of all, I mean, they are listed right next to each other in terms of performance. Like a 3080 and a 6800 XT are generally fairly close in performance unless you're using ray tracing. And the heavier the ray tracing effects, generally the further the 3080 will pull ahead, which indicates to me actually a potentially a good sign that the ray tracing in this game is not going to be massively performant demanding unless they're hiding the differences in the upscaling, where maybe the AMD card is relying on more upscaling than the NVIDIA card is. Because again, usually with ray tracing on, the 6800 XT would be falling a bit further behind. But we'll have to see how it goes. They do mention if you want 1440p 30, you could keep these same GPUs, but you're now down to 30 FPS if you just want to, I think, turn on all of the normal RT features. But then there's an Ultra RT mode. The Ultra RT mode is going to take a 4080 or 7900 XTX to hit 30 FPS at 4K. Now, 30 FPS at 4K, and by 4K we mean with some level of upscaling already enabled. that's a little bit scary. What is this Ultra RT mode? Is this maybe more of an NVIDIA-focused kind of heavy-duty ray tracing mode? I did find a RTX announcement trailer for the game that does appear to be showing off what the game looks like and performs like with ray tracing on versus off. Now, they don't specify the hardware or resolution that they're using here. I think oftentimes in these NVIDIA demos, it's showing the game running at like 4K DLSS performance with frame generation on an RTX 4090. That tends to be what they do in these kind of demo videos. I'm not sure if that's what they're doing here because it's not listed. But anyway, here's what that mode will probably look like anyway. So it does look like there's some sort of NVIDIA partnership here for their RTX on full ultra ray tracing mode. But again, if we want to kind of wrap this up, my overall thoughts on this is as long as these optional upscaling modes aren't like applying super aggressive upscaling to hit these specs, then I don't think any of this looks particularly unreasonable. And it's also nice to see that it's apparently Steam Deck verified. That's a good sign. But if they are heavily upscaling to achieve this level of performance, that's a bit more concerning. So we'll just have to see how this plays out once the game actually launches. And again, don't forget that you can pick up the recommended GPU for $160 or $150 if you use my discount code at jawa.gg by clicking the link in the video description or pinned comment. Or again, entire builds that meet the recommended specs, or even the probably a 1440p 60 high settings or even ultra settings type build here with maybe even some ray tracing on, or just pick up that 3080 itself for about $400 or $390 if you use my discount code. Anyway, thanks to Jawa again for sponsoring the video, and follow that link in the video description, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.